Okay, good morning, everybody. It is 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's presentation. My name is Michael Dampirio, and I'm the Water Resources Agent with IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. And today we're going to be talking all about lakeside living, exploring stormwater ponds, and living by stormwater ponds in your South Florida community. Extension is a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we use university research and resources to address local needs throughout the community with initiatives, classes, outreach, and volunteer opportunities. And we provide practical education to help residents, professionals, decision makers, and others build a better future. Today, we're going to be talking about stormwater ponds. So the first thing we need to know is what exactly is a stormwater pond? Many of our residents here in Sarasota County live on waterfront views, and a lot of us actually pay a good premium for these waterfront views in our community when they're on a lake or a pond. And you hear a lot of people say, I live on the lake in our community. People love to say that they live on the lake. And many residents, HOA board members, and even property managers may not know exactly what these bodies of water are. And a lot of us would love for our community lake to look a lot like the one in the picture with the beautiful, clear water. And that's not always really realistic. And the major reason for that is because these are not always natural bodies of water. They're typically not natural bodies of water, and they're really constructed as part of the community. Whereas the picture that you see on the screen is a natural body of water, and that is Lake Okeechobee here in Florida. So we like to think of these as natural bodies, but they are man-made and they need to be considered as such when we're talking about management and expectations with these water features. So odds are that the water body that you live on in your community is not a natural lake, but is actually a stormwater pond. And that's not a bad thing. Just because it's called a stormwater pond rather than a lake doesn't mean that it is anything negative at all. It's actually a very positive thing. Stormwater ponds are constructed as part of the community for real world reasons. They need to be there as part of the community for a variety of purposes. And the primary purpose is flood mitigation. So the primary purpose of these stormwater ponds in your community. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Dampirio, and I am the Water Resources Agent with UF IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. And today we're going to be learning all about lakeside living for Southwest Florida residents. And we're going to be exploring stormwater ponds in Southwest Florida, management considerations, and what to expect when living on these stormwater ponds. Extension is a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we use university research and resources to address local needs throughout the community through initiatives, classes, outreach, and volunteer opportunities. And we provide practical education to help residents, professionals, decision makers, and others build a better future. As I mentioned, today we're going to be learning about stormwater ponds, managing stormwater ponds, and expectations when living on a stormwater pond in Southwest Florida. So the most important thing that we need to start off with is what exactly a stormwater pond is. We need to understand what these features are in our community in order to understand what to expect and how to properly manage these features. I'll often hear people say that they live on the lake in their community, and that's always said with a sense of pride. People love living on the lake. They love their waterfront views. And people will often pay a premium for these waterfront views because they're beautiful, they're hot commodities in the community. But unfortunately, a lot of residents and even board members and property managers may not know exactly what these bodies of water are, and they're often mistaken for natural lakes and natural bodies of water. And we would always love to see the stormwater pond in our community look like what's pictured on our screen here with the beautiful crystal clear blue water. But that's not always the case. That's not always what we see when we look at these lakes and ponds in our communities. And that is largely in part because the picture on your screen is a natural lake. That is Lake Okeechobee here in Florida. Whereas the water features in your community and what you see in your neighborhood pond, you're actually looking at a man-made structure. We often call them lakes, but in reality, they are stormwater ponds. But that's not a bad thing. Just because it's a stormwater pond and not necessarily a natural lake does not mean that it's a bad thing. These stormwater ponds are part of the community for a real purpose. They are there for a reason, they're there with intent, and they provide a lot of benefits for our community. The primary reason that stormwater ponds are there is for flood control and mitigation. These areas serve as a catchment area for stormwater runoff and are our line of defense against flooding during heavy rain events, where the rainwater will drain into these stormwater ponds, helping to protect our homes and our neighbors and our communities from flooding and flash flooding. But in addition to the in addition to the flood protection, these stormwater ponds also provide a level of pollutant removal from our stormwater runoff. That is their secondary purpose, is to allow for an area for the stormwater to sit in order for pollutants to be removed from the stormwater before it is discharged downstream. But additionally, a well-managed pond can also provide wildlife habitat and aesthetics to the community. These stormwater ponds can be very beautiful features of the community, and that's why people love to live on them. So aside from their technical benefits and purpose of flood control and mitigation and pollutant removal, they have a lot of benefits for the community as far as aesthetics and quality of life go as well. It's important to understand what's going on with your stormwater pond, and I like to think of this a bit as the anatomy of a stormwater pond. So really how these ponds function and what they are. So essentially, stormwater ponds are designed to collect and retain stormwater runoff. As I mentioned briefly already, stormwater runoff is precipitation that runs off of hard surfaces, such as homes, driveways, roads, sidewalks, walkways, anything that is not allowing that rainwater to sink through the ground surface. The water that runs across that hard surface is referred to as stormwater runoff. And stormwater enters the storm drains and is transported through pipes to the storm pond, where it is held and collected, and that's how it protects us from flooding. And that holding capacity is what allows for some of those pollutants to be removed. And it's really common to see stormwater ponds in the community connected from one to the next. A lot of communities, especially larger communities, will have several stormwater ponds throughout the community, and these are often going to be connected by underground pipes from one to the next, where the stormwater ponds are really going to be sort of a chain of ponds rather than just one singular pond in a community. And the water that enters the stormwater pond will ultimately discharge downstream in one way or another, whether that's through direct discharge from a pipe into a nearby body of water, or if that is subsurface flow where the stormwater is traveling through the surface soil to the next body of water. Either way, eventually the water that is in the stormwater pond will find a way to the next body of water downstream. And again, these are meant to capture and contain stormwater runoff. So again, when water does not infiltrate through a surface, it's going to flow across that surface. And that's what we refer to as runoff. And runoff occurs when rainwater falls on impervious surfaces. Impervious surfaces are the term that we give to those surfaces that do not allow for water to sink through that surface. So think of things like asphalt, concrete, traditional stone pavers, rooftops, anything like that is going to be an impervious surface, something that does not allow the rainwater to sink through it. But we can also have runoff occur along pervious surfaces as well. So soil that is highly compacted can be susceptible to creating runoff when the water cannot sink through the soil efficiently because that soil is so compacted and pressed together. We often see this in developed communities just through the process of development, where the soil layers are sort of flipped upside down during the construction process through digging and building, and then driven over with heavy equipment. That can lead to compacted soil, and compacted soil can be susceptible to creating runoff, and also soil that is already saturated. So if the soil is already saturated, already holding a lot of water, water that falls in addition on that surface can end up running off as well. So we can have runoff that's usually seen along our impervious surfaces like asphalt, concrete, and rooftops, but we can also see some runoff across our lawns and landscaped areas due to compacted soil or soil that's already saturated. And you can see in the diagram that the stormwater runoff will run down these impervious surfaces, usually into the drain along the side of the road. And from the drain on the road, that goes right into the stormwater pond. The drains that are in the street, the storm drains, they're not connected to any sort of sewer system at all. They go right to the closest body of water, and that's usually going to be your stormwater pond. Here in Florida, we get a lot of rain. It's not feasible for the rainwater that enters the storm drains to be treated by a sewer system. So that goes right into the nearest body of water, which is our stormwater ponds. Irrigation can also contribute to runoff. So we're not just talking about water that falls on the ground due to natural rainfall. We're also talking about anything that puts water on the ground, whether that is washing your car, power washing your home, or a lot of times we see runoff occur with irrigation. So anything that's applying water, especially to these hard impervious surfaces, can create runoff. And that's very typical when we see overspray of irrigation onto impervious surfaces. These are some pictures that I took from a local community where you can see the irrigation is spraying directly onto the hard surfaces. And from the hard surface, that irrigation is running down the street and into the stormwater pond, or into the storm drain rather. And from that storm drain, that is going to likely be going right to the stormwater pond. So when you follow the pictures, you can see that the irrigation head starts off spraying on the driveway. From the driveway, it is running down into the street along the curb. And then from the curb, it goes right into that storm drain. And you can guess where it goes from there. Now, irrigation can be an additional concern for runoff because a lot of our, especially newer communities, utilize reclaimed water for irrigation. And reclaimed water is not a bad thing. Sometimes it gets a bad rep, but it's really, really not. It's actually a very positive thing. It's one of our biggest and heaviest tools that we have in our toolbox for conserving our potable drinking water supply. Essentially, what reclaimed water is treated, clarified, and sanitized domestic former wastewater. And that former wastewater, once it's treated and clarified, is used for irrigation, but it still contains residual nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And those residual nutrients are the same nutrients that are found in fertilizers. And what that means is that they allow for things to grow better. That will allow for plants to grow better, and that includes plants that live in the water, including algae. So when we have runoff that's created through reclaimed irrigation, we're looking at an additional component of the content of the nutrients that can be running right into our local bodies of water. And this particular community is on reclaimed irrigation. So you can see the water that's flowing down the driveway and the street right into the storm drain. That is that reclaimed water that contains those residual nutrients. So it's just an additional thing to be mindful of when we're looking at our irrigation. Is if we're on reclaimed water, it's even more important to be mindful of that runoff, even though it's always important to be mindful of runoff. And any sort of runoff that is produced can have the ability to transport nutrient or to transport pollutants rather. So just by the nature of runoff, what it is water running across surfaces that brings with it the natural ability to transport pollutants and bring them into our nearby bodies of water. So as it's running across the landscape, it can pick up any number of things. And this can include fertilizer pellets, pesticides, vegetative debris, and grass clippings are big ones that people don't often think of as pollutants. Things like sticks and leaves and grass clippings. They are pollutants when they enter local water bodies, especially stormwater ponds, because they can start to decompose. Pet waste is a particular pollutant of concern because there's some additional things with pet waste as well. Um, Solid litter is a big one. So as stormwater runoff runs down yards and streets and driveways and enters the storm drain, it can bring with it solid litter like plastic bags, plastic bottles, and just household trash, and that can make its way into our waterways. Metals, that's something that we don't often think of as a pollutant, but it's a very common pollutant of concern when stormwater runs across roadways. And that's just a byproduct of driving. Every time we hit our brakes, we have the potential to create small particles of metal dust. So the brake dust that accumulates, that is metals. And then also soils. Soils are something that, again, are not often seen as a pollutant, but when it enters the stormwater system, can be a pollutant because our soils, especially here in South Florida, can be bound with phosphorus, and bringing that sediment in with the stormwater can bring additional phosphorus, which is a nutrient. And if there is a lot of soil entering the stormwater system, if that's from an open construction site or broken ground that's not been covered, if there's a lot of silt and soil entering the water, that can actually cloud the waterway and make it hard for the underwater plants to grow and thrive because it can start to lower their light availability. So I mentioned grass clippings already. This is something that we don't often think of as a pollutant, but it really can be because the grass clippings can contain up to 3 to 5% nitrogen. You think of a grass clipping as relatively small, you don't think of it as much, but when you have a lot of it entering a local waterway, that can really build up. That can be adding nitrogen to the system. It can start to decompose. So you really don't want grass clippings entering your pond. And Sarasota County actually has a code that's meant to help protect against this. So Sarasota County code reads, in no case shall grass clippings, vegetative material, and or vegetative debris, either intentionally or accidentally, be washed, swept, or blown off into stormwater drains, ditches, conveyances, water bodies, or roadways. So if a landscaper is done and you have all of these grass clippings and they're just there for a little bit until they come along and clean them up and blow them back up onto the lawn, that's fine. But if they're left like this, that is actually not okay. These grass clippings can have the ability to enter our storm drains and come with it all of the things that we just mentioned. So stormwater and runoff and the pollution in stormwater runoff can bring with it water quality concerns. That's why we're concerned with it in the first place, is because of its potential effects on water quality. So the nutrients that are in stormwater runoff, they can feed algae that's growing in the water because they have that excess nitrogen and phosphorus. That can help contribute to additional algae growth, and algae growth can become a little out of control in some of these stormwater ponds if there is a lot of nutrients available to help feed that naturally occurring algae. And when algae gets to be out of balance, it can lead to things like low dissolved oxygen levels, and low dissolved oxygen levels can even lead to things like fish kills. So it really can be sort of a chain reaction. Algae is a natural part of the ecosystem. It should already be there in the water. But when you start giving it extra food, it's just like giving your plants extra food. So these nutrients are there to they help plants grow, and algae in the water are also plants. I mentioned pet waste as being a particular concern. That's because along with the nutrients that are contained in pet waste, you can also have the availability or the presence of pathogens as well. Pet waste can contain bacteria and parasites and some other nasties. So we really don't want that pet waste washing into our local waterways. Sometimes you'll see people walking their pets along stormwater ponds. The stormwater ponds in communities can be really a valuable green space for the community. And I'm not saying not to use that green space, just please clean up after your pet if you're walking, especially around the stormwater pond where that pet waste has the opportunity to wash into the waterway. So now we're going to start talking about the different areas of a stormwater pond. We're going to refer to what is called the littoral zone. So the littoral zone of a stormwater pond is the shallow area that makes up the inside perimeter of the stormwater pond. So the picture on your screen is a pond in cross section, and the shallow area making its way up towards the land is what we refer to as the littoral zone or the littoral shelf. That's that shallow area before it drops off into the deep water zone of the pond. And that's the area that will allow light to penetrate down from the surface of the water to the substrate below. And what that does is allow for the growth of aquatic plants. Now, we have aquatic plants in a few different varieties. So we have our immersed plants, which are those plants that grow with their roots in the soil and their stem and leaf structures growing up through the water column to emerge out of the top of the water. We have our free-floating plants. These are going to be things like duckweed that have their leaves on the surface of the water floating and then free-floating dangling roots within the water column. We have our floating leaved plants. Those are going to be plants that have their roots in the substrate of the soil under the water and then send up a long running stem with a leaf floating at the top. Think of things like water lilies. We have our submersed plants. Those are going to be the plants that are entirely under the water. They have their root structure, their stem structure, and their leaf structure all under the water within the water column. And then notice that we also have algae. As I mentioned, algae is a natural part of our aquatic ecosystem. Algae is bound to be present in water bodies. It should be present. It's part of our ecosystem. We just need to be mindful of it being in balance within the ecosystem. So back to the littoral zone itself, they're typically about 5 feet or less in depth, and that's what allows for that aquatic plant growth. That's the depth where a lot of plants can grow. Light is penetrating through the water down to the surface. I'm sorry, down to the bottom, rather. A lot of people will be concerned why these littoral zones are full of weeds. That's actually a common complaint is why is the pond full of weeds? They may not necessarily be weeds. A lot of the plants growing in a littoral zone could be beneficial native plants, and these may even have been intentionally installed by your community. So they may have been intentionally planted and not necessarily be weeds. And then any sort of reputable pond management company can help you maintain the look and the aesthetic of these littoral plants. And these littoral plants are there for a reason. These emergent native plants in the littoral zone, they can offer a variety of benefits for your pond. Those include helping to buffer the surface wave energy that contributes to erosion. If you look at the surface of your stormwater pond, you'll see gentle ripples that are going across the surface just from the air moving, especially if you have a fountain. Well, these plants that are growing up out of the water, they can help to block those ripples before they start to lap against the shore of the stormwater pond. Because over time, it doesn't look like much, but that gentle lapping action can actually contribute to erosion. So these plants help to stave that off by blocking that energy. These plants can help with the absorption and removal of pollutants through some natural processes. They can help keep algae out of sight. Like I mentioned, algae is a natural part of our aquatic ecosystem. We'll sometimes see floating algae in stormwater ponds. That floating algae will often be blown by the wind and be contained in like one sort of area of the stormwater pond. And if there's a lot of plants growing up through the water in that area, it can actually help to sort of corral that algae and keep it out of view so that your eyes go to the plants and not necessarily to the algae. So that'll allow some of that algae to remain in the ecosystem without it being so much of an eyesore. These littoral plants can be great habitat for birds and other desirable wildlife. A lot of people in homeowners associations love their stormwater ponds because of the birds that they bring into the community. Well, having a well-balanced ecosystem with these plants can help bring in some of those birds and wildlife for people to view. They can enhance the general ecological function of your pond just because it's getting closer to a natural system with these native plants. And it can increase the aesthetic value. These plants can be done in a very beautiful way that enhance the aesthetics of your stormwater pond. These are some common littoral plants. These are going to be the top four that we see in South Florida communities in that littoral zone. My favorite is the pickerel weed. That's the one on the top left of your screen. It has these spade-shaped or land-shaped leaves, and it produces a purple flower spike. That's a very popular littoral plant, along with duck potato right next to it. Duck potato will look a lot like the pickerel weed with its land-shaped leaves, but it produces a long, slender spike that's covered in really delicate white flowers. They're really pretty. Below that is spike rush. Spike rush can be a very quick growing littoral plant. It can grow very well. It can live in areas that maybe the pickerel weed or the duck potato are not doing too well in. If they start to die off, the spike rush may be able to grow in and fill in that niche and that void. Spike rush grows really well and really easily, and it's a very common littoral plant in the area. And then we also sometimes see golden canna. That is our native canna, and that likes to live in a bit shallower of the littoral zone, but when it's placed properly, it does really well, and it has these really beautiful yellow blooms that can really complement the purple and the white nicely when they're blooming. So we talked about the inside perimeter of a stormwater pond with the littoral zone. Now we're going to talk about the outside perimeter of a stormwater pond. And that outside perimeter, we're going to refer to that as a buffer zone. So a buffer zone is going to be the perimeter on the land side. Anything that we're doing to make a separation between the land and the water is going to be referred to as a buffer zone. And a buffer zone is defined as a vegetated area adjacent to a pond intended to require minimal maintenance and reduce external pressures on the pond. And when I say external pressures, I mean anything along the lines of mowing, fertilizer application, pesticide application, irrigation, those pollutants carried by runoff, vegetative debris, litter. Those are all external pressures. So the point of a buffer zone is to try to reduce these external pressures on the pond. Sarasota County Ordinance strongly recommends a 6-foot low maintenance buffer zone around all ponds. And again, it states that no vegetative material shall be deposited or left remaining in this zone or in water. So again, we would love to see a 6-foot buffer zone around all ponds. Sarasota County Ordinance also prohibits the use of fertilizer within 10 feet of any pond, regardless of if there's a vegetative buffer zone. The ordinance still prohibits the use of fertilizer within 10 feet of every pond. And this is something that's often referred to as the ring of responsibility, which is a term from the green industry's best management practices. And Florida-friendly landscaping would like to see no mowing, fertilizing, or applying pesticide within 10 feet of a pond as well. So really, we're trying to get people to move these actions away from the water's edge. 6 to 10 feet would really be great. And these buffer zones, they have a lot of purposes, and one of their purpose is runoff pollution interception. So you can see on your screen, this is one of my favorite pictures of how buffer zones can actually stop some of this solid litter from entering a waterway. You can see there are some native bunch grasses around this stormwater pond, and up against the bunch grasses are the pieces of trash that have been stopped from making their way into that stormwater pond. So they can act as a physical barrier for contaminants getting into the stormwater pond. And then they can also trap things like grass clippings, pet waste, fertilizer pellets, and maybe even sediment from getting into the waterway just by having that barrier there. And again, those are all things that can be contributing excess nutrients, with the exception of the solid litter that we just want to keep out of the water just to keep it out of the water. But these buffer zones can also contribute some protection against erosion. So we already talked about how the littoral plants can protect about erosion. Well, these buffer zones can also protect against erosion. These buffer plants are going to be taller than your typical mowed turf grass. and the taller plants will allow for more developed and deeper root development. And those deeper, more developed roots can help to anchor and hold soil in place along the pond banks. So if you have the littoral plants that are helping to block that wave energy, and you have these tall native bunch grasses around the perimeter of your pond with those deep, complex root structures helping to hold the soil in place, you can be looking at a really good spot for helping to prevent any further erosion along your stormwater pond. You can also allow existing turf grass to grow to a taller height by implementing what's called a no-mow zone. There are some benefits and challenges that come with a no-mow zone as well. I love the decorative look of intentionally installed buffer zone. The picture on your screen is muley grass along a stormwater pond, and in autumn it blooms this pink color, and it can be really, really beautiful. It can be a great landscape feature for your community. And these buffer zones, especially the landscape buffer zones, again, they can really help enhance the aesthetics of the community. So, it's nice to have these plants rather than just the bare soil along a pond's edge. And these can always be tailored to a community's desired look. So working with a landscaper is really important to help make these buffer zones look the way your community wants them to look. And these buffer zones can also offer some additional wildlife habitat. So a well-managed buffer zone of native plants can provide habitat for local wildlife and birds, especially if you have things that are bringing in pollinators. If you're bringing in pollinators, you could be bringing in more food sources for birds and starting off that ecology and the food web at the bottom with the plants, bringing in the additional things so that, again, your residents can enjoy the birds and the wildlife coming and going from the pond. I mentioned no-mow zones. The biggest benefit of a no-mow zone is that there is already going to be turf around your stormwater pond, and you are allowing the turf that is already existing to grow up just to a taller height. And that taller height is going to be, in theory, providing some of these buffer zone benefits. And it's really quick and easy to implement a no-mow zone because that turf is already in place. That is the biggest benefit of a no-mow zone over a landscape buffer zone, is that you are really utilizing what's already there. So the turf is already there. You're just allowing it to grow taller. And that can act as a physical barrier for pollutants. But then again, in theory, by allowing that turf grass to grow taller, you could be allowing those roots to grow deeper and getting the benefit of those deeper roots in the root zone. But a no-mow zone is not the same thing as a no-maintenance zone. Any sort of buffer zone is meant to be a low-maintenance zone, not a no-maintenance zone. And that's important to keep in mind. No landscape is maintenance-free, and this includes buffer zones around stormwater ponds. So the no-mow zones can be susceptible to harboring invasive plants like torpedo grass. They can also harbor weeds. So if you're doing a no-mow zone as a buffer zone, it's really important to maintain this area for weeds. And when there is undesirable plants popping up in a no-mow zone, it's important to pull those and remove them, or else whatever's already existing in that seed bank and in the turf can become more obvious once that turf starts to grow taller. It's typically maintained around 10 to 15 or 8 to 12 inches tall. And one of the things that this does is also keeps the heavy lawnmowers off the banks of the pond. So if you are just maintaining a height of, let's say, 8 to 12 inches, and you're going to be using a string trimmer to maintain that, you're going to be keeping heavy riding mowers and heavy lawn equipment off the edges of the pond. The edge of the pond can be saturated and susceptible to erosion and giving way under heavy equipment. And if a lawnmower tips into a stormwater pond, that can be really, really dangerous for the rider. So just another benefit of keeping things away from the edge of the pond. And it's important to trim these no-mow zones in order to maintain a more manicured appearance. And that needs to be done in a way that keeps the grass clippings out of the water. So we already talked about grass clippings entering the water through runoff. Well, you don't want them entering the water as you're trimming these no-mow buffer zones either. So it's important to trim them in a way that keeps the grass clippings up on the land not in the water. And that can be just using your string trimmer in a way where you are aware of which direction the string is spinning so that you are shooting those grass clippings up onto the land, not right into the water. And communication is really key in any sort of landscaping or buffer zone, but especially with these no maintenance zones. Community management needs to really communicate the plans of the buffer zone to the contracted landscape maintenance company. And the landscape maintenance company needs to communicate this to their technicians and employees so that everybody's on the same page. That way, you don't have somebody coming by one week and allowing the grass to grow taller, and then somebody coming by the next week mowing it all down and getting all the grass clippings right into the water. It's really a matter of communicating this with the landscape management company, and the landscape management company communicating the needs of the community to their employees and their technicians. And with any sort of buffer zone or changes to the pond, it can be really, really beneficial to have a meeting between representatives of both the community management, the pond maintenance company, and the landscape maintenance company all together in the same room, just to set goals, priorities, and responsibilities. So talking about who is doing what, who is in charge of maintaining what, and what that contract needs to look like. So having a meeting with the HOA board and both of these contracted entities is a really, really good idea. So on the opposite side of the no-mow zones in the buffer zone world, we also have our landscaped buffer zones. So again, those no-mow zones are where you're just allowing that existing turf grass to grow taller. Well, you can also do more of an intentional landscaped buffer zone. And I personally love the way that these look. I think they can be beautiful. I think they can be a real benefit to the community when they're installed properly. And with these landscape buffer zones, instead of allowing the existing turf grass to grow tall and allowing those roots to grow deeper, you're going to be utilizing the larger and more complex root structures of some native bunch grasses. So these are going to be things like muley grass, which is the pink blooming grass in the picture, Fakahatchee grass, dwarf Fakahatchee grass, cord grass. So just our native bunch grasses that can all have a decorative feature to them as well. And again, these native plants can provide food and habitat for wildlife, including birds. And when you're installing native plants in your landscape and around stormwater ponds, there are several local grants that are available that can help with the cost of installing these plants, or at least purchasing these plants. Also, the landscape buffer zones can be edged in order to maintain a neat appearance. And sometimes it may even be easier for landscape companies to edge these areas because they're just going to be edged with a little bit of herbicide every now and then to keep the weeds from intruding. And that could be easier than maintaining a no-mow zone at a certain height. That would be up to the landscape maintenance company to decide which one would be easier for them. But a really, really important thing when you are considering adding a landscape buffer zone is proper site preparation, as well as diligent plant selection. So you need to select plants that are going to do well in this environment. It can be a tough environment because it can be susceptible to alternating water levels where it can be flooded and then dry out. So that poses a challenge in plant selection over just a traditional landscaping scenario. But at the UF IFAS Extension Sarasota County office, we have a lot of resources for helping residents and homeowners associations select the proper plant and the right plant for the right place that'll do well in that environment. And after you select your plants, proper site preparation is key. Everything that is there needs to be properly prepared with all of the turf and weeds thoroughly removed, or else you could be opening yourself up to those weeds and invasives growing right back through the landscaped area. So proper site preparation is key. Again, selecting the plants to install around the pond poses a challenge when compared to just selecting plants for a traditional landscape. But the University of Florida has developed a database on trait-based selection of stormwater pond plants to help with residents, homeowners associations choosing which plant is going to do well in this area. You need to be very mindful of the bank slope, the water level fluctuation, and soil moisture when you are considering which plants to choose. These are all things that are going to really impact which plants will do well and be successful. And it's important to, again, work with your landscape maintenance company using that database in order to choose the best plants that are not only going to survive and do well, but also fit the aesthetic wants and needs of the community. These are landscaped areas. They should be features and beautiful parts of the community. So working with your landscape company in order to make that happen and fit the desired look of your community is really important. And it's also important to manage expectations when we are thinking about our stormwater ponds. So a sterile pond that has no plants, no algae, no wildlife, that may be out of balance. And this aesthetic also will require a high level of maintenance. These areas aren't going to naturally be sterile. So keeping them completely clean, completely clear, completely devoid of any plants and algae could require a lot of maintenance. And it's likely going to provide less ecological value as well. And again, algae is a natural part of the aquatic ecosystem. So a reasonable amount of algae should be accepted in these stormwater ponds. That's not saying that there should be no algae, but it's also not saying that algae should be completely covering the surface in the mat either. So just a reasonable amount of algae should be expected to naturally occur in these systems. And the emergent plants can help hide that algae from view while also helping to reduce that erosive wave action again as well. Florida has a rainy season and a dry season. That's another thing that's really important to remember when considering expectations for these stormwater ponds. The water level is going to naturally fluctuate from season to season. And within those individual seasons, the level may also fluctuate from year to year. So it's important to just be mindful of that while we are thinking about expectations for our stormwater ponds. And then also just remembering that a community's actions on land can impact the quality of its water resources. So the stormwater ponds in your community are really a window into your local immediate watershed. What's going on in your stormwater ponds as far as water quality can reflect what's going on with the on-land practices that are occurring throughout the community. Right, so to recap, most community water features are stormwater ponds, and stormwater ponds have two functions: flood mitigation and water quality improvement. Flood mitigation, we talked about with collecting that stormwater runoff to help prevent flooding. And then by allowing that water to sit and having the plants naturally grow in the water, we could be looking at removing some pollutants from that water as well before it's discharged to downstream waters. And there's a lot of things that we can all do to help reduce that runoff pollution, whether that's being mindful of our irrigation or keeping things like fertilizer and grass clippings away from impervious surfaces. The littoral zone is the shallow area of a stormwater pond that accommodates aquatic emergent plants. And littoral plants offer benefits for the ponding community by helping to slow down some of that erosive wave action. Buffer zones are areas adjacent to ponds intended to require minimal maintenance and reduce external pressures on the pond. And no buffer zone is completely maintenance free. I can't stress how important that is when managing our expectations. No landscape feature is maintenance free, and these areas are low maintenance. They are not no maintenance. So ongoing maintenance may be required to remove weeds and thin plants in your buffer zones. No? Okay, so with that, I think we are going to be ending. It is 12:56. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and I hope you learned a little bit of something. Thank you.